The winter wind howling outside, the great stone keep did not bite as fiercely as the words spoken within the grand hall. Elara stood hidden in the deep, velvet shadows of the carved stone pillars, the bitter cold seeping through her thin, formal slippers from the frosted stones beneath. The grand hearth roared, a monstrous thing of crackling oak and leaping flames, casting dancing orange light across the faces of her pack, but the warmth could not reach the sudden cavernous ice forming in her chest. She watched the man she had loved since childhood, the boy she had run with through the spring woods, bled with during the autumn hunts, and believed she would rule with. Kaelin, the newly crowned alpha of the Silver Pine Pack, stood before the breathless assembly. He was resplendent in ceremonial leathers, the silver torque of his office glinting at his throat. The mating bond, a fragile, unformed thread of starlight that had been pulling at her soul for years, tightened unbearably. It felt like a physical string drawn taut from her sternum to his. And then it shattered. It broke with a silent, agonizing snap that echoed only in Elara's mind, a terrible severing that left behind a hollow, ringing void and the distinct taste of ash on her tongue. He did not look at her. His gaze, heavy with a warm, possessive hunger she had always assumed was meant for her, was fixed entirely on Lyra. Lyra, Elara's younger sister, her sister whose laugh chimed like silver bells, whose golden hair caught the firelight like spun sunlight, who now stood radiant and blushing beside him, tilting her delicate neck to accept the claiming mark, the cloying scent of crushed pine needles, the musk of anticipating sweat from the crowd, and the sharp tang of absolute betrayal filled the air, choking the oxygen from Elara's lungs. The assembly erupted into deafening cheers, raising their heavy wooden goblets to the new alpha pair. The sound was a physical blow. Elara didn't weep. The tears felt flash-frozen in her eyes before they could ever fall, locked away behind a sudden icy wall of shock. In that moment of crushing public humiliation, amidst the joyous howling of the pack she had sworn to serve and protect, Elara made a choice. She would not remain to be the pitied shadow in her sister's blinding sun. The life she knew was dead. Without a sound, she turned her back on the light, the warmth and her history, slipping out the heavy oak doors and stepping directly into the blinding, unforgiving blackness of the winter snowstorm. The ancient forest was a cathedral of ice and absolute silence, its towering pines groaning under the immense weight of the blizzard. Elara had run until the muscles in her thighs screamed in agonizing protest, and her lungs burned with the inhaled frost, feeling as though she were breathing in ground glass. Her breath plumed like dragon smoke in the fractured, silvery moonlight that occasionally managed to pierce the thick canopy. She had taken nothing but the heavy, silver-lined cloak on her back. Abandoning the opulent, tapestry-draped chambers she had known all her life, the fading memory of her parents, and the only family that remained to her, every ingrained instinct, honed since she was a pup, demanded she turn back. The pack bond, even broken as her personal tie was, tugged at her to seek the safety of numbers, to find shelter, to submit to the hierarchy that now placed her sister above her. But the jagged, bleeding edges of her severed mate bond pulsed with a phantom agony that drowned out the very real, lethal cold gnawing at her unprotected fingers and toes. To return was to die a slow death of humiliation. To freeze was at least a quiet end. The Silver Pine territory ended abruptly at the frozen river, a jagged, treacherous scar carved through the landscape. It was a boundary no sane wolf crossed, a dead zone of shifting ice and deep, killing currents. Beyond the treacherous expanse lay the Blood Moon lands. It was a territory ruled by an alpha king, whispered about, only in terrifying bedtime stories meant to frighten unruly pups into obedience. A savage, a warlord who supposedly painted his face with the blood of his enemies, a beast who knew absolutely no mercy and recognized no laws but his own. But Alara was no longer tethered to sanity or fear. The riverbank sloped sharply downward, the ice glowing faintly with a deceptive luminescent blue under the obscured racing moon. It was deeply treacherous, groaning and shifting with the powerful hidden currents beneath, but it was the only viable path away from Kalen's scent, which still seemed to cling to the storm winds. It was the only way away from the triumphant, pitying smile she knew would soon grace Lyra's face when they realized she was gone. She pulled her cloak tighter, her numb, clumsy fingers fumbling with the intricate silver clasp at her throat, and took the first terrifying step. The ice shrieked beneath her weight, a high-pitched fracturing sound that sounded too much like a dying animal. Halfway across the vast expanse, the true unfiltered fury of the storm hit. A sudden violent squall of blinding white erased the sky, the moon, and the opposite shore in an instant. The wind physically battered her, a solid wall of kinetic force. Alara stumbled, her thin, snow-caked slippers losing all purchase on the slick surface. She fell hard, the impact jarring her bones, the black ice cracking ominously in a spiderweb pattern beneath her bruised knees. Panic, primal, sharp, and desperately clear, finally pierced the thick fog of her grief. She was going to die here, alone, a frozen monument to a broken heart, swallowed by the dark water. She scrambled forward on all fours, her dignity forgotten, desperately seeking the solid mass of the opposing bank, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. Then, a sound cut cleanly through the howling chaos of the wind. A low, resonant, bone-rattling growl that vibrated deep within her own chest, vibrating through the very ice she crawled upon. Through the swirling, chaotic vortex of snow, a massive silhouette materialized on the far shore. He was broader, taller than any wolf she had ever seen, a physical impossibility of muscle and fur. Even from a distance, he radiated an intense, almost suffocating wave of heat that seemed to actively battle the blizzard around him. The Alpha King. Torin. He didn't rush forward to help her. He didn't offer a hand. He stood perfectly still on the Blood Moon shore, a towering, nightmarish figure draped heavily in thick, dark bear furs. His eyes, burning like freshly forged steel in the storm's gloom, locked onto her struggling form. Alara froze mid-crawl, her canine instincts screaming at her to press her throat to the ice in absolute submission, warring violently with the human desperation to simply survive the crossing. Silver Pine. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, carrying effortlessly over the deafening shriek of the storm. It was not a question, it was an executioner's observation, cold and factual. Alara forced her trembling, frozen limbs to obey, dragging herself painfully upright. Her legs shook so violently she could barely stand, her knees knocking together, but she tilted her chin, meeting those terrifying, burning steel eyes, utterly refusing to lower her gaze. "Refugee," she rasped. The words scraped her raw throat, tasting like old copper and the ash of her ruined life. Torin tilted his head, a slow, calculated, purely predatory movement that reminded her of a mountain cat studying a wounded deer. The wind shifted abruptly, and the scent of him washed over her. Burning wood smoke, cold mountain iron, and something fiercely wild, ancient, and deeply earthbound. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. It made her heart stutter in a way the cold had not. "The river is cracking," he observed, his tone utterly devoid of empathy, stating a simple fact of nature as one might note the setting sun. As if his words were a supernatural command, a deafening gunshot-like crack echoed louder than the wind. The ice beneath Elara completely gave way. She plunged violently into the freezing, ink-black darkness. The absolute shock of the glacial water stole the breath and the scream from her lungs instantly. The current, impossibly strong and violent beneath the deceptive surface, immediately dragged her under the thick ice sheet. She fought instinctively, thrashing blindly toward the faint, fractured light above, but her heavy, waterlogged cloak became an anchor, dragging her mercilessly into the abyss. The cold was an absolute, all-consuming agony, piercing her brain like 1,000 needles, before rapidly fading into a heavy, terrifyingly peaceful numbing void. Her lungs spasmed, demanding air that wasn't there. Just as the edges of her vision bled into that peaceful, suffocating blackness, the ice above her shattered with a concussive force. A massive hand, rough with calluses and radiating an impossible, burning heat, clamped onto her upper arm like an iron vice, hauling her violently upward into the roaring storm, breaking the surface of the water and the threshold between life and death. She awoke not to the biting, screaming wind, but to the rich, grounding scent of burning cedar and the rhythmic, snapping crackle of a massive hearth fire. Elara forced her heavy, gritty eyelids open to a world painted entirely in shifting firelight and deep, velvety shadows. She was lying on a massive bed, buried beneath layers of impossibly soft, heavy wolf and bear pelts that weighed her down like a comforting anchor. She was enveloped in a dry, radiating heat that felt simultaneously healing to her frozen bones and inherently dangerous to her survival instincts. Her wet, ruined clothes were gone. She was now dressed in an oversized, soft linen tunic that smelled faintly of male musk, crushed pine, and ozone. The room was vast, its architecture constructed of dark, unyielding stone and thick, hand-hewn heavy timber. It was utterly stripped of the ostentatious, gilded wealth she was accustomed to in the Silver Pine stronghold. There were no delicate tapestries depicting ancient victories, no silver mirrors to reflect vanity. It felt raw. It felt purely functional, designed to withstand a siege rather than host a ball. A dense shadow shifted near the edge of the roaring hearth. Torin. He had shed his heavy, snow-covered outer furs. He stood wearing only loose, dark trousers and a thin linen shirt that did nothing to hide the sheer, coiled power of his physique. The flickering firelight caught the harsh, unforgiving angles of his face and illuminated the jagged, pale scars that marred his strong jawline and disappeared beneath his collar, hinting at a life measured in violence. He was methodically stoking the fire with a heavy iron poker, his movements precise, efficient, and deliberate, treating the massive logs as if they were twigs. "You are a foolish creature, little wolf," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the very floorboards beneath her bed. He didn't turn to look at her, his attention seemingly fixed entirely on the dancing flames. Elara tried to push herself up onto her elbows, but her muscles screamed in agonizing protest a stark reminder of the frozen river's near victory over her body. "I was leaving," she managed, her throat raw and scratchy, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper that barely carried over the crackle of the fire. He finally turned, the heavy iron poker hanging loosely, dangerously, in his massive hand. His metallic gaze swept over her in the bed, clinical, detached, yet holding a heavy, analyzing weight that made her breath hitch in her chest. "You chose a poor path. The frozen river claims many stronger, older wolves than you. It seemed preferable to the alternative." She held his gaze, refusing to cower beneath the heavy furs. Torin approached the bed slowly, his bare feet making absolutely no sound on the cold stone floor. The sheer, overwhelming size of him was suffocating in the enclosed space of the bedchamber. He stopped just out of arm's reach, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the faint, sickly pale aura that clung to her. The spiritual bruising of a shattered mate bond, visible only to those who knew what to look for. "Kaelin of Silver Pine rejected you." It wasn't posed as a question. The wilderness was vast, but the whisper network among the packs, carried by wind and passing rogues, was faster than any messenger, especially across enemy lines. Elara looked away, fixing her eyes on the rough, unadorned stone wall, as a hot, prickling rush of shame flooded her cheeks, burning away the lingering chill of the river. "He chose another, my sister. His profound loss," Torin murmured. The words were spoken so softly, so devoid of his usual gruff, commanding tone. She almost thought she had imagined them over the sound of the fire. He reached out. Elara flinched instinctively, anticipating a blow or a harsh grasp. But his large, rough hand merely hovered over her damp forehead, before gently, carefully resting against her feverish skin. The heat of him was staggering. It wasn't just physical warmth. It was a deep, resonating energy that sank through her skin, diving deep into her marrow, instantly soothing the deep-seated, lingering chill that the fire could not reach. "You have no pack now," he stated, his thumb brushing a stray, damp curl from her eyes with surprising delicacy. "No alpha, no protection. You are a rogue in a harsh winter." "I ask for none," she lied smoothly, her chin tilting up defensively, summoning the very last shreds of her aristocratic pride. "I am perfectly capable of surviving alone." A dark, dangerous, deeply amused smile touched the corner of his mouth, softening the harsh, brutal lines of his scarred face for a fleeting second. "Pride is a very poor substitute for warmth, Elara." He knew her name. The realization sent a shiver down her spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the cold. It meant he had known who was crossing the ice. He withdrew his hand abruptly. The sudden, stark absence of his searing touch left her feeling surprisingly cold and deeply bereft, her skin tingling where he had rested his palm. "You will remain here in this room until you are strong enough to travel without collapsing. I will not have you freezing to death on my doorstep. When the healers deem you fit, you will leave my territory." He turned and walked toward the heavy, iron-banded oak door. "Rest, Silver Pine." The door shut with a solid, echoing thud, the heavy latch dropping into place with finality. Elara was left alone with the dancing fire, the lingering scent of his musk, and the deeply unsettling, terrifying realization that she felt safer here, locked in the den of the fabled Blood Moon warlord, than she had in the grand halls of her own home. She closed her eyes, pulling the heavy pelts tightly up to her chin, breathing in the scent of wood smoke, cold iron and the Alpha King, letting it lull her into an exhausted sleep. The subsequent days blurred into a quiet, monotonous routine of slow recovery. True to Torrhen's word, Blood Moon healers, stern, quiet women with gentle, incredibly capable hands, tended to her. They moved silently around the room, forcing bitter, dark herbal teas down her throat to ward off lung fever, their faces impassive but their actions surprisingly tender. As her physical strength returned, allowing her to sit up and eventually walk without collapsing, Alara realized this stronghold was vastly unlike the bustling, noisy, politically charged halls of Silver Pine. Silver Pine was a place of endless, elaborate banquets, whispered court gossip, and constant vying for social position among the elite. Blood Moon was a fortress of quiet, absolute discipline. When she was finally allowed to roam the inner keep, she observed the wolves moving with a silent, deadly grace. There was no posturing here, no flashy displays of wealth. There was only preparation and survival. Though she was given freedom to wander the cold stone corridors, she was acutely aware of the watchful, unblinking eyes of the heavily armed Blood Moon guards positioned at every archway and stairwell. They never spoke to her, but they never looked away. She saw Torrhen infrequently. He was an Alpha King utterly consumed by the grueling burdens of his crown. A ruler constantly locked in strategic councils with his war leaders, or aggressively training his warriors in the snow-dusted courtyards below. Yet his imposing presence permeated every inch of the damp stone walls. She felt him even when she couldn't see him, a low hum in the air, a scent of ozone that heralded his passing through a hall moments before she arrived. One evening, driven from her bed by the relentless quiet ghosts of her past and the hollow ache in her chest, Alara wandered aimlessly through the sleeping keep. She found herself pushing open heavy, brass-studded double doors into the grand library. It was a cavernous circular room lined with thousands of ancient, leather-bound tomes and scrolls. Dust motes danced lazily in the stark beams of moonlight, filtering through the high, arched, stained glass windows, casting colorful, fractured shadows across the floor. She found Torrhen there. He was seated in a massive, high-backed leather chair near a dormant hearth, a heavy, ancient ledger resting open on his lap. He looked exhausted, the shadows beneath his steel eyes stark and bruised in the dim, silvery light. The lines of his face drawn tight with unspoken burdens. He didn't look up from the yellowed pages as she stepped softly onto the woven rug, her footsteps muffled. "You are restless, little wolf. The healers said you should be sleeping. The quiet here is unfamiliar," she admitted, her voice echoing softly in the cavernous space as she stepped further into the room, drawing her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. "My old home was never this silent. There was always music, or arguing, or laughter." He closed the heavy ledger with a deep sigh, the sound loud in the stillness, and finally lifted his head to meet her gaze. Silver Pine is a pack of politics, vanity, and whispers. They concern themselves with how they appear. Blood Moon is a pack of survival. We concern ourselves with continuing to exist. We do not waste breath on things that do not keep us alive. Alara moved slowly to the tall arched window, looking out over the sprawling, snow-covered training courtyard below. The moonlight painted the world in stark black and white, highlighting the deep tracks left by the day's drills. "They call you a savage in the southern packs, you know," she said quietly, tracing the intricate frost patterns on the cold glass. "A bloodthirsty warlord who rules his people entirely by fear and violence, someone who would slit a throat as easily as blink. "And what do you see, Alara?" he asked. His voice was low, smooth, and laced with a quiet, dangerous challenge that made her turn around. She faced him across the length of the room. She looked at the harsh, brutal scars crisscrossing his skin, the unforgiving set of his jaw, the immense, lethal power coiled in his resting frame. But she also remembered the way the warriors in the courtyard bowed their heads to him, not in trembling terror, but with profound, absolute reverence. She remembered the impossible, gentle heat of his massive hand, resting against her fevered skin when she was at her weakest. "I see an alpha who bleeds to protect his own," she said softly, the truth ringing clear and undeniably true in the quiet room. "I see a man who carries the weight of a harsh world, so his people don't have to." A flicker of something entirely unreadable, something dangerously hot, ancient, and starving, crossed his steel eyes. He stood up. The movement was deceptively smooth for a man of his immense size, devoid of any stiffness. He crossed the distance between them with unsettling, predatory speed. Moving like a shadow across the moonlight, he stopped mere inches away, his towering frame completely boxing her in against the cold glass of the window, forcing her to tilt her head sharply upward to maintain eye contact. The air between them suddenly crackled with a potent, heavy energy, making the fine hairs on her arms stand up. The scent of him was overwhelming up close, wild pine, ancient earth, and intoxicating raw masculinity. "And who protects you, Alara?" he whispered. His gaze, heavy and heated, dropped momentarily to track the nervous, rapid parting of her lips before snapping back to lock onto her eyes. Her breath hitched audibly. Deep within her chest, the raw, aching ghost of her shattered mate bond twinged in faint protest, but the pain was instantly, completely swallowed by a new, terrifying, and unfamiliar heat, blossoming rapidly in her core, a primal response to his proximity. Before she could find the breath or the words to answer, the heavy oak doors of the library burst open, slamming violently against the stone walls. A breathless guard stood in the threshold, his chest heaving, his hand tight on the hilt of his sword. "Alpha King," the guard gasped, his eyes darting quickly between Torin and Alara. "Intruders spotted at the southern border, a large scouting party from Silver Pine. They are armed and they are not trying to hide their tracks." Torin's expression hardened instantly, the molten heat in his eyes flashing back to unforgiving cold steel. The fragile, highly charged moment between them shattered like thin ice under a heavy boot. He was the warlord once again, his mind already on the battlefield. He strode swiftly toward the door, not sparing another backward glance at Alara. "Rouse the vanguard," Torin commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Prepare the hunting party. Let us see what the pups of Silverpine think they can achieve in the dark." By the time Alara reached the high battlements, the entire stronghold hummed with a tense, terrifyingly controlled energy. She stood gripping the icy stone parapet, the rough stone biting into her palms, watching the Blood Moon warriors assemble in the torch-lit courtyard below. There was no shouting, no chaotic rushing to find weapons or armor. Only the grim, silent, heavily practiced efficiency of a pack born and bred for war. They moved like a single, massive organism. Torin moved among them, a dark, imposing figure issuing silent commands with sharp, economical gestures. He mounted a massive, ill-tempered black warhorse, a beast that looked as though it were forged from shadow itself. His face was a mask of absolute cold fury. He wore no armor, only his dark leathers and a massive, rune-etched broadsword strapped to his back, a weapon that looked entirely too heavy for a normal man to lift. He was riding out to kill wolves from her former pack, wolves she had known by name, wolves she had grown up with. The realization churned her stomach, twisting her loyalties into agonizing knots. The heavy iron gates ground open with a metallic shriek, and the hunting party vanished into the swirling, blinding snow, leaving the keep in a suffocating, deeply unsettled silence. The hours dragged on, like thick, freezing molasses. Elara paced the length of her chambers, her bare feet wearing a frantic path in the woven rug. Her heart was a battlefield. She was torn violently between a lingering, deeply ingrained loyalty to the people she had known, and the strange, terrifying, rapidly growing connection she felt pulling her toward the Alpha King who had saved her life when her own people would have let her die. It was near dawn, the eastern sky slowly bleeding a pale, bruised purple, when the heavy gates opened again. The air immediately thickened with the sharp, metallic tang of blood and the sour, heavy scent of exhausted sweat and wet fur. Elara threw on her cloak, not bothering to fasten it, and rushed down the winding stone stairs to the courtyard, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs like a trapped bird. The warriors were dismounting, their faces grim and streaked with dirt, their weapons drawn and stained with dark, freezing blood. Torin was the last to ride through the gates. He slid heavily from his massive horse, his movements unusually stiff, utterly lacking their normal fluid, predator's grace. His dark linen tunic was torn open, stained a deep, wet rust color on his left side. Elara pushed aggressively through the perimeter of tired guards, ignoring their surprised warning growls and the hands that reached out to stop her. She reached him just as his boots hit the cobblestones, and he swayed slightly, an almost imperceptible weakness, catching himself against the heavy leather saddle. "You're hurt," she breathed, her hands instinctively reaching out, hovering just inches from the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt, terrified to touch but unable to pull away. He looked down at her, his steel eyes slightly clouded with pain and deep exhaustion, his breath pluming rapidly in the freezing morning air. "It is nothing, a scratch from a desperate, panicked pup who swung wildly in the dark." "Let me see," she demanded. She was surprised by the fierce, unyielding tone of her own voice, a command rather than a request. To the absolute shock of the watching, battle-hardened guards, the terrifying Alpha King did not snap at her or push her away. He offered no resistance. He merely grunted, a low sound of acquiescence, and allowed her to slip her slender shoulder under his good arm, guiding his massive, heavy weight into the keep and slowly up the stairs to his private, heavily guarded chambers. Once inside, the door bolted behind them. She commanded him to sit on the edge of the large bed. The wound was far worse than a simple scratch. It was a deep, jagged gash slicing across his ribs, an ugly tear in his tough flesh that smelled strongly of burnt ozone and silver, a lethal, agonizing poison to their kind. Elara worked with frantic, focused efficiency. Her hands were remarkably steady as she stripped away the ruined shirt, exposing his heavily scarred chest. She cleaned the sluggishly bleeding wound with hot water from a basin, wincing in sympathy as the silver residue hissed against the wet cloth. and applied a thick, stinging poultice of crushed moonflower and bitter herbs she found rapidly in his extensive healing supplies. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the scent of blood and herbs, charged with unspoken words and the ragged, shallow sound of his breathing. They were not just scouting, they were tracking, Torin finally said. His voice was a low, pained grumble as she wrapped a clean linen bandage tightly around his broad torso, her arms inadvertently having to wrap entirely around his massive chest to secure the knot, pulling her intimately close. Ilara's hands faltered, her fingertips pressing momentarily into the warm, feverish skin of his back. Kaelin, the newly minted Alpha claims you stole something of immense value from the pack vault. Before you fled into the night, he sent heavily armed trackers. He demands your immediate return to face pack justice and execution. Torin reached out, his large, blood-stained hand closed firmly around her slender wrist, stopping her movements and forcing her to meet his intense gaze. The heat of his touch was searing, grounding her spiraling panic and focusing her entirely on him. Did you take anything? I took absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back and my own life, she said fiercely, her eyes blazing with a sudden, hot, righteous anger that burned away her fear. He lies. He wants to punish me for surviving his rejection, for not breaking quietly. He wants to drag me back and make a public example of me for embarrassing him by leaving before he could formally cast me out. Torin studied her face for a long, intense moment, his eyes searching hers for any flicker of deceit, any hidden truth. The suspicion slowly faded from his gaze, replaced rapidly by something far more dangerous, primitive, and overwhelmingly possessive. He pulled firmly on her wrist, drawing her slightly closer between his spread knees. The movement clearly pulled agonizingly at his fresh, silver-laced wound. But his face remained a mask of carved stone. Then let the boy try and take you, Torin murmured. His voice was a deadly purr, a promise of violence. His thumb broke free of her wrist to brush softly, deliberately, over the erratic, hammering pulse, pounding visibly at the base of her throat. You are under my protection now, Ilara, and I do not yield what is mine to anyone. The formal written ultimatum arrived 2 days later, carried by a trembling, terrified Silverpine emissary, who looked as though he expected to be eaten alive the moment he crossed the drawbridge. He presented the scroll with shaking hands. Kaelin haughtily demanded Ilara's return by the apex of the next full moon, precisely 3 days away, or he would officially consider her harboring an act of open, unprovoked war between the packs, promising to bring the full might of Silverpine down upon the Blood Moon stronghold. Torin sat upon his carved, unyielding wooden throne in the great hall, reading the hastily scribbled, arrogant missive. His expression was a terrifyingly blank mask, unreadable and cold. He crumpled the thick parchment slowly in one massive fist, the dry, crinkling sound echoing sharply in the utterly silent room. He shifted his gaze to Ilara, who stood pale but resolutely tall, beside the roaring hearth, her hands clasped tightly before her. He is a fool blinded by his own bruised ego and newly found power, Torin announced, his voice carrying effortlessly, without shouting, to his gathered council of elders and battle-scarred warlords. He risks a war he absolutely cannot win, all to reclaim a woman he foolishly, publicly threw away. With respect, Alpha King, a grizzled, heavily scarred elder named Kael spoke up, stepping out of the line of warriors, leaning heavily on a staff. We should send the girl back. We are prepared for the deep winter, not a siege. She is a Silver Pine exile, a broken wolf. She is not worth the blood of our warriors. Handing her over secures our borders." Alara flinched, the harsh, practical words striking true, twisting the knife of her own deep guilt. She was a refugee, a burden, a spark that could ignite a massacre of people who owed her nothing. She stepped forward, her chin held high, fully intending to offer herself up to Kaelin's justice, to spare this pack the devastation of conflict. Before she could open her mouth to speak the words of surrender, Torin held up a single large hand. The room fell into an instant, suffocating silence, thick with anticipation. "She stays," he commanded softly, yet the words felt like a physical blow to the room. He turned his burning steel gaze slowly onto the dissenting elder. "We do not cower before the idle threats of a boy playing at being an alpha. We do not surrender those who have sought and earned our sanctuary. If Silver Pine wants to paint the snow with their blood, we shall happily oblige them." Later that freezing evening, Alara wrapped herself in a heavy cloak and ventured out into the biting air. She found Torin alone in the moonlit training yard. He was stripped to the waist despite the bone-chilling cold, brutally punishing a thick wooden pell with measured, terrifyingly fast strikes of his heavy broadsword. The fresh white bandages wrapping his ribs were stark against his tanned, scarred skin, and the scent of silver still lingered faintly in the air around him. She stood quietly in the deep, ink-black shadows of the archway, mesmerized, watching the fluid, lethal play of heavy muscles across his broad back, the raw, barely contained power he unleashed with every single devastating strike. He stopped suddenly, his chest heaving, sweat gleaming like liquid silver on his shoulders in the moonlight. Without turning, he spoke. "Come out of the shadows, little wolf. Your scent gives you away. No matter how quiet you step." She stepped hesitatingly into the silver light. "You shouldn't risk your people for me. The elder was right. I'm a stranger. I can leave tonight. I can disappear into the human territories or travel north." He dropped the heavy sword into the snow with a dull thud and closed the distance between them in 3 long, purposeful strides. The intense, heady scent of his exertion, mixed with pine and cold night air, wrapped entirely around her senses, overwhelming her. "And go where?" he demanded softly, looking down at her, his immense presence dwarfing her. "To freeze in the high mountains? To be hunted down like a frightened rabbit by Kaelin's trackers and dragged back in heavy iron chains?" He reached out, his hand surprisingly gentle, as a heavily calloused finger traced the delicate, trembling line of her jaw. "I told you in my chambers, you are mine to protect. I do not break my word, and I do not retreat." "But why?" she whispered, the desperate, unanswerable question trembling on her lips, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Why do you care what happens to a broken wolf from an enemy pack?" Torin looked down at her, and for the first time, the impenetrable, stone mask of the warlord slipped completely. It revealed a raw, intense, starving hunger beneath, a vulnerability that was far more terrifying than his anger, because, he murmured, his face lowering slowly until his warm, spice-scented breath ghosted tantalizingly across her lips, making her eyes flutter shut instinctively. "When you stepped onto that fracturing ice, when you looked death in the eye and absolutely refused to submit, you didn't just cross a physical border, Alara. You crossed directly into my soul. You showed a strength I have rarely seen. He didn't kiss her. The restraint radiating from his tense muscles was a physical pressure in the air. He stepped back abruptly, the sudden loss of his encompassing burning heat, leaving her shivering violently in the snow, breathless and deeply confused. Tomorrow at dawn, I go to the frozen river to meet Kaelin, Torin stated, his voice returning to its normal flat rumble as he picked up his heavy sword. I will end this foolishness before it begins. Prepare yourself, Elara. Tomorrow everything changes. The border at the frozen river was a stark, brutal line drawn in the ice and snow, a physical manifestation of the hatred between the packs. The tension in the biting morning air was thick, suffocating, and tasted heavily of ozone and impending violence. Torin stood impossibly tall on the Blood Moon bank, his dark, heavy fur-lined cloak billowing violently in the icy, biting wind. His elite warriors fanned out in a perfect, highly disciplined V-shaped formation behind him. Silent, deadly, their hands resting loosely, confidently on the hilts of their drawn weapons. Across the invisible, lethal divide stood Kaelin, flanked by a massive, disorganized contingent of Silver Pine warriors who looked decidedly nervous, their eyes shifting uncomfortably under the silent, predatory stares of the Blood Moon vanguard. Lyra was there too, standing a safe distance behind Kaelin. She was wrapped tightly in pristine white Arctic fox furs, looking small, pale, and entirely terrified of the monstrous spectacle of the Blood Moon King. Elara watched from a high, densely forested ridge overlooking the river valley, her heart trapped painfully in her throat. She had been strictly forbidden to leave the keep, ordered to stay under heavy guard in her chambers, but she couldn't stay behind, pacing blindly like a trapped animal, not when Torin was risking his life and his entire kingdom for her. She had slipped the guards in the chaos before dawn. Kaelin stepped forward to the very edge of the fracturing ice, his voice ringing out, artificially loud and laced with a desperate, brittle arrogance. Torin of Blood Moon, you harbor a known thief and a traitor to my pack. Return her immediately to face my justice, and we can avoid spilling your people's blood on this ice today. Torin's laugh was a low, chilling, guttural sound that echoed menacingly across the snow-covered valley, causing several Silver Pine wolves to shift uneasily and grip their weapons tighter. You speak of treason and broken laws, boy? Torin mocked, his voice booming with unquestionable authority, carrying easily over the river. Yet it was you who publicly broke the most sacred ancient bond of our kind. You threw away a flawless diamond to eagerly pick up a common polished pebble. He didn't so much as glance at Lyra, but the devastating insult hit its mark perfectly. Kaelin's face flushed a deep, violent crimson with uncontrolled rage. I demand trial by combat, Kaelin roared, drawing his intricately etched, ceremonial silver-edged broadsword, pointing it aggressively across the ice. Alpha against alpha, for the honor of my pack and the immediate return of what is rightfully mine. A shocked, fearful murmur rippled through the Silver Pine ranks. It was a suicidal challenge. Torin was a living legend, a battlefield monster who had never lost a duel in 2 centuries of rule. Torin did not bother to draw the massive blade strapped to his back. He merely smiled, a cold, terrifying baring of sharp teeth. He began to unfasten his heavy cloak, his movements agonizingly slow and deliberate, designed to mock and infuriate his opponent. "You claim she is yours, Kaelin," Torin called out, dropping the heavy furs carelessly into the snow. Standing only in his leather armor, the white bandages visible beneath the lacing. "But you do not know her true value. You were too weak, too blind to see it. You never deserved her, and you certainly do not deserve her now." The fight was brutally, shockingly short. Kaelin charged recklessly across the slippery ice, fighting with the frantic, sloppy desperation of a man trying to aggressively save face before his doubting pack. His strikes were wild, wide arcs fueled entirely by blind anger and deeply wounded pride. Torin fought with the cold, calculated, terrifying precision of an apex predator, simply playing with its food before the kill. He didn't shift into his monstrous wolf form, nor did he use a blade. He relied entirely on the immense, supernatural strength and blinding speed of his shiftless form. Kaelin lunged forward, massively overextending his reach, aiming a lethal thrust directly for Torin's injured chest, seeking the silver wound. Torin merely sidestepped the flashing blade with effortless grace. In a blur of motion, too fast to follow, Torin caught Kaelin's extended, vulnerable arm, twisting it sharply and brutally. A sickening loud crack echoed across the silent valley. Kaelin screamed in sudden, blinding agony, the silver sword dropping from his paralyzed fingers to clatter uselessly on the ice. Before Kaelin could draw a ragged breath, Torin swept his heavy, steel-toed boot out in a devastating arc, sweeping Kaelin's legs out from under him and sending the Silver Pine Alpha crashing heavily, breathlessly onto his back. Upon the hard, unforgiving ice, Torin stood over the broken, gasping man, breathing perfectly evenly, not a single drop of sweat on his brow. He planted his heavy leather boot firmly, suffocatingly, onto the center of Kaelin's chest, applying increasing pressure until the ribs began to groan. "Yield," Torin commanded softly, his voice echoing like rolling thunder. Kaelin, gasping frantically for air through the blinding pain and utter crushing public humiliation, spat a mouthful of hot blood onto the pristine white snow. I yield." Torin stepped back in visible disgust, turning his back on the defeated Alpha. "Take your broken Alpha and crawl back to your trees," he commanded the stunned, utterly silent Silver Pine warriors. "Elara is under the absolute, unbreakable protection of the Blood Moon. Any further incursion onto my lands will not end in a merciful duel. It will end in a slaughter that will erase your pack from history." As Kaelin was hastily, shamefully dragged away by his panicked guards, Lyra weeping hysterically beside him, Torin turned his massive shoulders, his molten steel gaze lifted unerringly, piercing the distance and the thick trees, locking directly onto the high ridge where Elara stood, hidden in the deep pines. Even from a mile away, she felt the physical impact of his stare like a hand on her chest. It was not a look of victory, it was a searing, absolute claim, stronger and deeper than any physical mark or spoken vow. The ride back to the towering stronghold was a silent, intense victory march. The Blood Moon warriors radiated a smug, deadly satisfaction. Their loyalty to their king cemented even further by his effortless display of dominance. Elara did not wait in her own assigned quarters. Driven by a nervous, crackling electric energy, humming violently under her skin, she paced the stone floor of Torin's private chambers. She had directly, flagrantly defied his strict orders by following them to the border, but the crushing, overwhelming relief that he was unharmed entirely overshadowed her immediate fear of his inevitable anger. When the heavy oak door finally groaned open, he filled the massive stone frame. He looked exhausted, covered in the dirt and sweat of the ride, but utterly, terrifyingly victorious. He saw her standing nervously by his roaring fire, and a slow, dark, intensely predatory smile curved his lips, reaching his tired eyes. "You disobey direct orders, little wolf," he said softly, stepping inside and closing the heavy door firmly, throwing the iron bolt into place. The sound was incredibly final. "I couldn't just sit here and wait," she admitted, her voice barely a trembling whisper in the sudden, charged quiet of the room, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. "I had to see. I had to know." He crossed the room slowly, deliberately, stopping mere inches from her, trapping her between his massive frame and the heat of the fire. The scent of the winter wind, the adrenaline of battle, and his own rich, intoxicating, heady musk enveloped her completely. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers, tracing the delicate shell of her ear, sending violent shivers racing down her spine and pooling low in her belly. "I did not fight for my pride today, Alara," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated pleasantly against her own chest. "I did not fight for territorial dominance or to humiliate a boy. I fought for you. I fought to ensure you would never have to look over your shoulder again." He brought both large hands up to cup her face, his thumbs gently, reverently brushing across her high cheekbones. His eyes, usually the color of cold, unforgiving steel, were now molten, burning silver, radiating an intensity and a raw, primal hunger that stole the breath completely from her lungs. "I know exactly what Kaelin broke inside you," Torin said, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper, laced with a deep, empathetic emotion she had never heard the warlord use. "The rejection, the violent shattering of the soul bond. I felt the agonizing echo of it when I pulled you from the freezing river. I felt your soul tearing itself apart." Alara looked up at him, her vision blurring rapidly as hot tears finally welled in her eyes. The first tears she had shed since the terrible night of her betrayal in the Grand Hall. How could you feel it? It was my bond, my pain. "Because, my brave, foolish Alara," he leaned down, pressing his forehead firmly against hers, his breath hot and ragged against her parted lips. "The fates are often incredibly cruel in their brutal lessons, but they are also absolute in their precision. That boy, Kaelin, was never your true mate." He brushed his lips against hers, a tentative, questioning whisper of a touch that belied his massive strength. It was a single spark hitting dry tinder, igniting an instantaneous, raging firestorm in her veins, burning away the last of the winter's chill, the lingering, painful ghost of her old, broken bond, the hollow, nagging ache she had carried for weeks like a stone in her chest, vanished entirely in a split second. In its place, a roaring, vibrant, brilliantly blinding connection snapped violently into place, an unbreakable, glowing tether anchoring her soul directly to his. With stunning, irrefutable clarity, it was a feeling of absolute completion, a puzzle piece sliding perfectly into place. "I am," Torin finished, his voice a ragged growl against her mouth. He didn't wait for her response. He captured her lips in a deep, bruising kiss that was a searing brand, a solemn, unbroken promise, and a complete, absolute claiming all at once. She melted against him, surrendering completely, her hands wrapping tightly around his neck, pulling his heavy warmth closer. He tasted of wood smoke, of brutal, hard-won survival, and of a deep, ancient, patient love that had waited quietly in the dark for her to finally find her way home. The harsh, brutal winter eventually broke, its icy grip giving way to a fierce, vibrant, and sudden spring that painted the towering mountains in brilliant greens, purples, and golds. The Blood Moon stronghold, once purely a grim, foreboding fortress of stark survival, now thrummed with a new, different kind of vibrant life. Alara stood on the high stone balcony overlooking the expansive, bustling training yards, the warm, golden morning sun kissing her face and catching the fine silver threads woven intricately into her dark, elegant gown. She wore the rich, deep crimson and black colors of Blood Moon proudly, no longer a refugee, but a ruler. Resting comfortably, heavily against her collarbone was the thick silver chain of the Luna, the unmistakable mark of her authority and her bond. The fierce pack had not merely accepted her, they revered her. They recognized her not just as their terrifying Alpha's fated mate, but as their true queen. She had brought a quiet grace, a sharp diplomatic intelligence, and a gentle, healing touch to the harsh fortress, providing a perfect, vital, and much-needed balance to Torrhen's raw, unyielding power. Where he was the sword, she was the shield. Down in the muddy, churned yard below, Torrhen was sparring bare-chested with a group of young, eager, highly skilled warriors. His movements were fluid, deadly, and breathtaking to watch. A masterclass in violence and control. He sensed her gaze, as he always inexplicably did, feeling her presence like a warm hand on his shoulder. He paused mid-strike, effortlessly lowering his heavy wooden practice blade, and turned to look up at her high balcony. Even from the great distance, the mating connection between them hummed. A physical, tangible, vibrating force, pulling them constantly together. He offered her a rare, stunningly genuine smile, a softening of his harsh, scarred features that was a precious sight strictly reserved only for her eyes. There had been no further trouble from the southern borders. The news of Kaelin's devastating, humiliating defeat at the frozen river had thoroughly fractured his already tenuous rule over Silver Pine. He was now locked in a desperate, losing struggle to maintain control of a pack that openly questioned his strength, his judgment, and his tarnished honor. Lyra, the Whisper Network actively claimed, had grown bitter, cold, and incredibly distant. The harsh, ugly reality of her stolen, cowardly prize was proving far less glamorous and far more difficult than the romantic, foolish fantasy she had envisioned. Alara felt no lingering anger, and certainly no pity for them. She felt only a profound, peaceful sense of absolute detachment. They were ghosts of a past, smaller, insignificant life. They were simply a necessary, intensely painful trial that the fates had used to drive her out of the shadows and directly toward her true destiny. Torrhen handed his practice sword to a panting, awestruck warrior and strode purposefully toward the keep, his molten silver eyes never leaving hers, burning with the same intense hunger she had seen that first night in the library. A few moments later, he bounded up the final stone stairs, completely ignoring his saluting guards, and pulled her forcefully, fiercely into his arms. The second he stepped onto the sunlit balcony, he buried his face deep in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply, a low, contented rumble vibrating in his broad chest as he grounded himself entirely in her unique scent of spring rain and blooming mountain wildflowers. My queen, he murmured reverently against her warm skin, the title holding more weight than any vow. Elara smiled, resting her head against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest, closing her eyes and listening to the steady, incredibly powerful, comforting rhythm of his heart. She had walked through literal ice and devastating, soul-crushing betrayal. She had faced down a legendary feared warlord and found the missing half of her soul hidden beneath his scars. She was finally, truly, and safely home. The harrowing journey from a violently shattered bond to a brilliantly forged destiny ends not in tragedy, but in the warm, fiercely protective embrace of the Blood Moon Keep. Elara, once discarded as a shadow and broken by betrayal, found her true, unyielding strength in the brutal harshness of the winter storms and the undeniable, blinding truth of her true mate. Torin, the universally feared warlord, discovered a beating heart he thought had been long frozen by war. Thawed completely by the quiet, defiant courage of a silver wolf, their love, born from desperate survival and fierce defiance, stands as a lasting testament that fate cannot be dictated by weak men or cruel sisters. In the wild heart of the Blood Moon territory, Elara reigns not just as a Luna, but as a queen who bravely chose her own path, proving definitively that true power lies in the courage to walk away from betrayal and directly into the waiting arms of destiny.